Okay, back now with Colin Bennett talking about flying saucers over the White House. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, Colin, there's been some really interesting books in the past few weeks that have come out, especially the Annie Jacobsen book, Area 51, which I'd love to get your opinion on later in the show. But where we left off before the break was we laid a foundation about this really interesting Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was sort of the understudy possibly to the Enola Gay. He was in the 509th, very interesting character, and then all of a sudden he gets stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to man what is now, or to head what is now known as Project Blue Book. This is before it became public, way before it became public. And that's sort of where we left off. And where I want to take it now is to where this cover came from, which is flying saucers over the White House. And you said that offline it happened over, was it a 2-week period? Why don't you get into how that story developed?
Well, if we can visualize Washington National Airport on July the 19th, 1952, the controller was Harry Barnes. There were 3 main centers of air activity in Washington at this time. Remember, traffic was not as intense as it is now. There were 3 main bases. There was Anderson Air Force Base, there was Bolling Air Force Base, and there was the National Airport. Okay, Harry Barnes, the controller, is of the 2 radars, one long range, one short range, at Washington National Airport, gets reports of radar returns from glowing objects in the night sky above the Capitol building. And these are solid returns. And of course, then, as now, this is restricted airspace, to say the least. There's nothing supposed to be there. And Harry Barnes, being a civilian, doesn't quite know what to do with these orbs of light, which are maneuvering at great speed or even at slow speed and glowing brighter or diminishing glow. And they're performing this kind of ballet over Washington. And later on, we saw that even honeymoon couples in the parks photographed them. And the photographs are in books there.
So these are mostly like orb-like structures.
Yeah.
Your typical, were they in some sort of formation? Are we talking about 1? Are we talking about 6? What are we talking about?
We're talking about 8.
Oh,
8
okay.
to 10. Yeah. And this is what I don't understand. And this is what a lot of American historians don't understand. Harry Barnes, who of course was an intelligent and sharp individual, being controller of Washington National Airport, for goodness sake, he decides to call in interceptors from Anderson Air Force Base, a few miles away.
Okay.
And here's some mysteries for you. Anderson Air Force Base replies they don't have any interceptors available because the airport, the runways are under repair. And the same reply came from Boeing. Now, you've got the president asleep in his bed. You've got the whole Washington complex underneath these orbs, and there's no F-94 night fighters available.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. It's a kind of, I'm sorry to say this about my beloved America. I am married to a wonderful American woman. I'm sorry to say this, but it was just a reflection of 9/11 snafu.
I was going to say, maybe they had box cutters. Who knows?
Maybe they had box cutters, yeah.
That's how easy it is to take over the country. Who knows? Right. I think the irony of what you just said is that I feel that part of the UFO enigma is how much and how little control the U.S. government and the governments in general have over their own airspace. Exactly,
yes. It's difficult for me to understand. It's in 9/11 when the Air Force was being interceptors. The F-16s were again being managed not by a top flight general with ribbons down his neck, but by Dick Cheney, a civilian.
Exactly.
A man with no... he's maneuvering fighters around? Well, anyway, that's a question mark we can't answer yet.
Exactly.
But
Now back to Ruppelt. What is he doing
back
at
to
this
Ruppelt.
point? These things
so
are flying over the entire capital and the president's house.
And the newspapers flash bulbs are popping.
Right.
It was that big, and yet no. Excuse me. I'll start again. It was that big, and no F-94s available. Okay, the F-94 was the night fighter of the day. It was a humble aircraft at the side of, 60 years later.
Right.
It did a modern look about it. It was a swept wing configuration. It had a radar operator and operating the radar gun lock in the rear cockpit, and underwing drop tanks, etc. That's quite an efficient aircraft for its day. Now the reports came in from the pilot. Sorry, I'll just start ahead of myself. I'm going a bit ahead of myself.
That's okay.
Barnes, the controller, called, I think it was Newark Air Base, send me an interceptor immediately because I can't get any from Washington. Newark replied, we are sending an F-94, okay? And the F-94 took hours to come. Washington could have been blown up, annihilated. But the command structure was just as cranky as it was in 9/11 with the F-16s. And
right.
So, the pilot arrives finally. He said he couldn't see anything. Why? Because, astonishingly, the orb lights have all gone off the screens. They switched themselves off. And Harry Barnes claims that whatever these orbs were, they were listening to the VHF. And we're talking about statements by responsible people here,
Sure.
It's short. During the day, Harry Barnes had the lives of hundreds of people in aircraft. And, he'd make one mistake, and a few hundred people, probably more, could die. So he's as steady as a rock. And he's reporting, in his opinion, they were listening to the VHF. The F-94 from Newark, I think it was Newark, maybe I'm mistaken, it doesn't matter, it's a distant airbase, has to return. He's low on fuel. So this is an amazing snafu. And it's right at Pearl Harbor and 9/11.
Well, at the same time, you have to be thinking that these gentlemen are also probably thinking that this could be an air attack from another country, obviously, not extraterrestrials, correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you heard the roar of an F-94 in the night sky, what the hell would you think? You'd think, what on earth are they playing at? That must be an enemy interceptor. The United States Air Force wouldn't behave like this. So so couples in the park were listening to the roar of this interceptor.
Wow.
Yeah, and the orbs were dancing around it, and just literally like dancing, toying with it. And again, photographs were taken by honeymoon couples and by bicyclists and bozos and God knows what. And, I'd talk about objectivity. Yeah, and there we are. So the next day, of course, the papers are playing hell. There's headlines, 4 inches high. Still, no statement from the United States Air Force High Command.
Nothing.
Yeah, still nothing from Congress, even though the night sky was full of strange objects.
And what was Ruppelt doing during this? What was his role?
Ruppelt was in Dayton receiving these reports.
Okay.
And trying to analyze them as best he could. Ruppelt was still a humble captain. Now, you'll find sections in my book in which General Madaris, a radical general of the 1950s, talks about bureaucracy as a problem. They don't take notice of a single captain. Goodness only knows what rank you have to be before the general staff of the Air Force take notice of you. And so Ruppelt is a humble captain. Moreover, he's an enlisted man, which the Air Force saying, yeah, well, he's not a regular, like you know. And I think the third sin is his third sin. Well, he was technically brilliant, far more brilliant than a lot of men of higher rank above him. Now, you know, in an organization, that doesn't do you a lot of good. Yeah,
No.
Particularly, no, it doesn't.
Sometimes it's better not to raise your hand.
Yeah, exactly. That was his position in a nutshell.
Yeah, I dig that.
Yeah, so he's only a captain. He can't start ringing big bells. Well, there are no big bells to ring. They're all asleep. Where was Vandenberg? I can't find the name Vandenberg. He was head of the bloody Air Force, for goodness sake. And his name doesn't appear.
Who knows? Maybe Dick Cheney was in charge.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. His name. Excuse me.
Well, okay. So these things, they buzz Washington for an evening. Everybody sees them. Again, this is interesting to point out to people. Very similar to Roswell, as I draw the distinction and the comparisons more.
I'm sorry.
Is that this came out in the news? This actually hit the papers, just like the Roswell incident did.
It did in Roswell to a certain extent, but the major Washington papers were strip-lining it. Okay, still nothing happened. Where was Vandenberg? Where was Twining, head of Air Force Intelligence?
Yes.
Nowhere. Paul Rupo. Okay, so everybody's screaming, but nobody's doing anything. Okay. So now we know that situation. We go forward now to the next weekend, which was July the 23rd. Poor Harry Barnes is still in charge at night of the control system, the traffic
shaking
control
like
system.
a leaf.
Yeah. And again, he looks at his watch and can't believe his eyes. They're here again. This time, lots of them.
Oh, no.
About 40. Yeah. Again, he orders interceptors. This time, I think it was from Delaware. And Delaware...
Sure, why not?
There's still no interceptors over Washington, There's still... Andrews Air Force Base is down. Bolly is down, yeah.
Gosh.
Over the head of the president, for goodness sake. The president's sleeping in bed. There isn't a single interceptor available to protect Washington. Who was responsible for this? Should be court-martialed. But, nobody was, I can tell you that.
Well, Colin, we know that accountability doesn't really work in this country very well when there's debacles.
No, it doesn't.
The word doesn't exist, actually. So.
Yeah, and as far as I know, there was certainly no court-martial. Well, I don't know what you call it.
So this poor guy spills his coffee on his lap again because here they are again, the crazy
There they are again. Yeah, same controller. A week later, and this time they perform, and even more. I always say erotic, but that's the only element that doesn't appear in the story. The erratic performance. Again, honeymoon couples go wild. In the parks, shooting the cameras. Again,
that's right.
This time the papers go absolutely berserk.
Okay.
And take photographs of the damn thing. Photographs available by the dozen. And he calls for interceptors from Newark. No, the Delaware. Now, again, here, we have to remind ourselves that here is a civilian, ordering fully armed warplanes into the air on an interception mission. I'm sorry, I live in little old England,
Right.
And the idea of a Heathrow controller asking for tornadoes into the air, ordering tornadoes into the air, is inconceivable.
Now, do we know what their orders were? Were they ordered to just observe?
Or were they ordered?
Go ahead.
These are military planes. No civilians allowed to come near them. Here in Britain, no civilian could give a military plane an order without getting in touch with the Royal Air Force, for goodness sake, whose planes they are. But here you have civilian bombs ordering fully armed interceptors from Delaware. 2 of them arrive. Okay. Now let's just backtrack.
Okay, hold on a second. We got a break here. Let's break, and let's come back. Let's get into what eventually happened and how Ruppelt ended up playing a part in, I guess, the future of Blue Book and where it went. Coming back, Colin Bennett, author of Flying Saucers Over the White House. This is Ufonaut Radio.
Yeah, standing by.
Off before the break was we laid a foundation about this really interesting Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was sort of the understudy possibly to the Enola Gay. He was in the 509th, very interesting character, and then all of a sudden he gets stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to man...
in Washington at this time. Remember, traffic was not as intense as it is. There were three main bases. There was Anderson Air Force Base, there was Boeing Air Force Base,
okay,
and there was the National Airport. Okay.
What is now, or to head, what is now known as Project Blue Book. This is before it became public, way before it became public. And that's sort of where we left off. And where I want to take it now is to where this cover came from, which is flying saucers over the White House. And you said that offline it happened over, was it? Okay, back now with Colin Bennett talking about flying saucers over the White House. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, you know, Colin, there's been some really interesting books in the past few weeks that have come out, especially the Annie Jacobson book, Area 51, which I'd love to get your opinion on later in the show. But where we left, the 2-week period, why don't you get into how that story developed?
Well, if we can visualize Washington National Airport on July the 19th, 1952, the controller was Harry Barnes. There were three main centers of air activity.